I do want to. I want to be respectful of your time, so I want to switch gears while we've still got you, and see if we're not going to get to everything that we want to get to. But I at least wanted to do the vaccine distribution part. Forrest, do you have that?
Yeah. So a big part of Biden's, I guess we hit like a year since the lockdown happened. Like last year. So Biden gave his big COVID address, and I kind of wanted to start with this on it because like the point that we're at with vaccines is a lot better, obviously, than we were at Trump. And I know you wrote kind of an article about vaccine distribution at the beginning of Biden's term. So I don't know.
We're also working with governors and mayors in red states and blue states to set up and support nearly 600 federally supported vaccination centers that administers hundreds of thousands of shots per day. You can drive up to a stadium or a large parking lot, get your shot, never leave your car, and drive home in less than an hour. We've been sending vaccines to hundreds of community health centers all across America, located in underserved areas. And we've been deploying, and we will deploy more mobile vehicles and pop-up clinics to meet you where you live, so those who are least able to get the vaccine are able to get it. We continue to work on making at-home testing available. And we've been focused on serving people in the hardest hit communities of this pandemic: Black, Latino, Native American, and rural communities. So what does all this add up to? When I took office 50 days ago, only 8% of Americans, after months, only 8% of those over the age of 65 had gotten their first vaccination. Today, that number is 65%. Just 14% of Americans over the age of 75, 50 days ago had gotten their first shot. Today, that number is well over 70%. When I came into office, you may recall, I set a goal that many of you said was kind of way over the top. I said I intended to get 100 million shots in people's arms in my first 100 days in office. Tonight, I can say we're not only going to meet that goal, we're going to beat that goal, because we're actually on track to reach this goal of 100 million shots in arms on my 60th day in office. No other country in the world has done this. None. Now, I want to talk about the next steps we're thinking about. First, tonight, I'm announcing that I will direct all states, tribes, and territories to make all adults, people 18 and over, eligible to be vaccinated no later than May 1. Let me say that again. All adult Americans will be eligible to get a vaccine no later than May 1. That's much earlier than expected. Well, let me be clear. That doesn't mean everyone's going to have that shot immediately, but it means you'll be able to get in line beginning May 1. Every adult will be eligible to get their shot. And to do this, we're going to go from 1 million shots a day that I promised in December, before I was sworn in, to beating our current pace of 2 million shots a day, outpacing the rest of the world. Secondly, at the time when every adult is eligible in May, we will launch, with our partners, new tools to make it easier for you to find the vaccine and where to get the shot, including a new website that will help you first find the place to get vaccinated and the one nearest you. No more searching day and night for an appointment for you and your loved ones. Thirdly, with the passage of the American Rescue Plan, and I thank again the House and Senate for passing it, and my announcement last month of a plan to vaccinate teachers and school staff, including bus drivers, we can accelerate massive nationwide effort to reopen our schools safely and meet my goal that I stated at the same time, about 100 million shots, of opening a majority of K through 8 schools in my first 100 days in office. This is going to be the #1 priority of my new Secretary of Education. Miguel Cardona. Fourth, in the coming weeks, we will issue further guidance on what you can and cannot do once fully vaccinated to lessen the confusion, to keep people safe, and encourage more people to get vaccinated.
All right. So, Natalie, what tell us about your vaccine distribution article and where things are at with this right now?
Sure. Yeah. So for the nation, I guess it was a month or two ago at this point, I did like a long, deep piece into vaccine distribution, kind of zoomed out look at all of the issues with it. And one thing that I think has been overlooked, and I think that the biggest root explanation for a lot of problems, particularly earlier on, was the fact that public health departments were begging for federal money to run their vaccine distribution programs since, early summer, when it started to be clear that some of these vaccines were pretty promising. And they didn't get that funding approved until the second COVID relief bill at the end of December. And then it took another month or so before most of the departments actually got that money, which of course was, over 2 months or around 2 months into vaccine distribution. It had already started. And that's better late than never. But that basically means that for the largest mass vaccination program in American history, which, we've obviously done a lot of vaccinations and there are things that everyone gets vaccinated for, but they don't happen all at once, right? Like there's never been a time when all 300 million people in a country have to be vaccinated at once. And there's no real mechanism for that. They had to devise a lot of protocols and systems that didn't exist, and not knowing whether they'd get the money, they couldn't hire new people. If you'll also remember, a lot of public health departments are seriously cash strapped, particularly, a lot of them lost a ton of funding in the austerity after the 2008 crash, and in a lot of cases haven't been replenished. And so, you had these public health departments that basically had to coordinate on a dime. And I think that a lot of them tried to do that really effectively. I talked to, a ton of people trying to run their vaccination programs in local county X, and they were, developing volunteer programs, and they were, using Eventbrite websites to try to coordinate signups, blah, blah, blah. But the reason that it was so hard, there were so many kerfuffles, is because this money came way too late, and they basically had to design or improvise systems in the meantime. And if you have to improvise systems without any money, that basically means that you're going to prioritize passive mechanisms, right? Like if you're using Eventbrite software, you're basically going to say, okay, we'll set up a thing here, you come to us. And I think it's pretty obvious who's best able to navigate those systems, who's the one who's able to, be available midday to game the system, to keep logging on, to figure out where the appointments are, to, go to the one that opens up wherever they can. And, they were going to prioritize richer, whiter people. And that's, what happened. I think that places that did the best are places that were able to exercise a certain amount of flexibility in a targeted way. So, the place that I wrote about in that piece was a town called Central Falls, Rhode Island, which had the highest rate of infection in the state of Rhode Island. And, I think on par with some pretty hard hit areas. It's the only majority POC city in the country or in the state, and had the highest rates of poverty. And basically they trained locals, so people from the local community, to be health ambassadors, to, earlier on in the pandemic, to, talk to people about masking and get people enrolled in clinical trials, and, talk to them about infection mitigation protocol. And they were able to get mask usage rates up, et cetera. And then they were also being used to help people sign up to actually, go to public housing to, vaccinate entire buildings. They would also sit outside the Dollar Tree and City Hall, et cetera. And that they ended up being very successful because they were sending out healthcare workers to these hardest hit areas and these marginalized communities. And, more places have started taking up that model, especially now that funding is available and they have been able to hire more people to do that work. Ultimately getting people vaccinated and distributing vaccines, you need some, especially with the first two, the Pfizer and the Moderna, where you have to have this really intense cold chain technology because it had to be kept so cold. Now with Johnson & Johnson, the actual distribution is a little easier. There are still hiccups here and there, but the situation is a lot smoother than it was. And, I think that people still don't totally get, and pundits don't seem to get when they said like, well, why is this so hard? What's going on? I don't like vaccinating an entire country has never been done, not in this context. And it's really, really hard. I think it would have been hard no matter what. And there were obviously some pretty significant roadblocks.
Biden seems to be doing a better job with that messaging too, talking about kind of mobilizing people to be vaccinators. That's not something I really heard Trump ever talk about necessarily at all, or like, you know what I mean? Like a lot, like it's interesting that he seems to be catching on to that messaging pretty quickly.
Yeah, it is like, this is one of the weirdest things about the COVID crisis, because if you imagine like the disaster movie version of COVID, like the one like how like the Hollywood movie would have gone in the last 20 minutes when people were finally getting vaccinated, it wouldn't be this like different rules in every state and people going to get vaccinated at CVS and and all this stuff. It would be like this line of like National Guard stuff set up to vaccinate everybody. That's what you would be primed to expect.
To be fair, the Aaron Sorkin version of it might actually entirely involve people arguing about where to best hand out vaccinations.
The minutiae of the rules for how to do it, and people doing walk and talks talking about how exactly which group should be prioritized. Yeah, but I think I'm glad that it's happening more. But the distinction Natalie's making there is really important, because certainly anecdotally, like. I have my, I got my first shot, finally last week, and granted, I live out in the middle of nowhere, so like it wouldn't, but like, I had to drive like about half an hour to, to the place where I got it. People I know who wouldn't necessarily qualify for higher risk groups who've gotten it. I tend to hear these stories and know, like, this is not to say anything bad about anybody who, my position is that anybody who has a chance of getting a shot right now should race to take it, but like, people will tell me these stories about, oh, I got a call from such and such, and they said there were some shots at this place that, they couldn't find anybody to get. And all I can think whenever I hear this stuff is, oh, you couldn't find anybody? Like how many, like, what they mean is not enough people came in of their own steam to do it. Like, I really want to know what would happen if, like, how many Walmarts are in between this person who's driving into this place where they couldn't find anybody and the vaccination site, like walk into the Walmart and say, hey, is anybody here, not gotten a shot and wants one? And I'll bet you could find somebody to take all of those doses. But for the most part, that's not how it's being done.
Yeah, I think it's, it's interesting. Every country is doing it a little bit differently. And I think that part of why in the US you have so many situations like that is, partially because of our piecemeal healthcare system that, we don't have a system like in the NHS, everyone is enrolled with a primary healthcare provider, and that's kind of like a natural landing pad, and that the person has a list of their patients. Like, I talked to, for that piece, I, interviewed people who worked for public health departments, and like, they don't have a list of like, here are the 75 plus year olds who live in this county. Like that doesn't like that. There's no way to like find that information and use it. There's no way to like reach out to those people. So like without those pre-existing institutional relationships, which by the way, I think is another reason like why it's easy to understand why, you know, childhood immunizations work so much more smoothly, not just that it's fewer people at a time than had to be vaccinated now, but you know, when you're born, you have an institutional tie to the place where you were born. You know, the pediatrician, the most babies are born in hospitals, and you know they're keyed in there, and then you know through school. So you know people kind of become less tethered to those systems as they get older and become adults. So you know, for a variety of reasons, and just because you know there never was like a streamlined planning process, Biden brought up the idea of you know one website exercise like designed at the federal level that everyone can use, which is like a classic example of something that would have been super convenient to have if the COVID funding had freed up months before. You know, that's one thing that I think states and local health departments really had to bend over backwards trying to figure out. And that, you know, in most cases they didn't. And people keep coming for shots, so it's kind of resolved itself in this strange piecemeal way. But yeah, I mean, the way that it got resolved is that there are a lot of people just kind of doing their own thing. There's like piecemeal processes, people driving 2 hours to get something. There have also been more, you know, vaccination teams dispatched to hard hit areas, which, you know, I think is really what was necessary from the get-go and what's already done in other contexts. You know, I mean, tuberculosis workers do that now. They, you know, go to where patients are to deliver medication and observe dosages and that kind of thing. But, you know, better late than never.
Yeah, having a big federal website like that, though, is also something that can go wrong pretty fast, as we saw with like the Obamacare website when they first launched it, crashing over and over again. Like, I don't know. I think that it's so interesting to see systems fail during a crisis, because, you know, it's not like one system fails and then they fix it and then like another, like it's like all systems fail at once. And having somebody like Trump that's actively kind of fighting against releasing any federal funding, like you really see everything fall apart that quickly. But then at the same time, like somebody like Biden coming in and just kind of doing basic things that would help out a lot, like common sense things, they get way too much praise for that, I feel like. But I mean, you know,
I mean, having the federal website, you know, assuming that it's not, you know, whatever, right? But you know, making that assumption is definitely a step in the right direction. I mean, that's a good thing. There should be one centralized place you can look up where you can get a vaccine, but also having the only way for people to get vaccines is that they look it up and they find time to go there. Just, I mean, doesn't seem, certainly doesn't seem like the most efficient, you know, way to do it. And
definitely not to vaccinate a whole country.
Yeah,
like,
and it's also definitely not the most egalitarian way to do it for all the reasons that Natalie was talking about. You know, there are like, you know, who's, you know, just having, you know, having it be a matter of, you know, the person who got was sent home with an employer laptop a year ago, you know, and is doing their white collar job from home is a lot more likely to get on that website and find, you know, where they can be vaccinated, you know, than some who's, you know, who's working all day and, you know, coming home and worrying about, you know, who's taking care of the kids, you know, et cetera. I mean, like this, I mean, it does seem like if you're going to equalize that at all and just, again, get as many people vaccinated as quickly as humanly possible, you know, you really do want to be sending the vaccine to the arms and not the other way around.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, another thing I've said about this before, I think that all of that stuff makes sense. And when it comes to, you know, Trump and his handling of the coronavirus, I feel like I've generally been pretty resistant to arguments that Trump is an anomalous president. I think that, you know, the better way to understand him is that he's the logical endpoint of several years worth of processes in the Republican Party, et cetera. I do think that certain aspects of the coronavirus, Trump was worse than any other Republican would have been. Chief among them is messaging, which sounds like a little thing. Usually when people talk about Trump's civility and Trump's style, it's like, okay, whatever. Like, what's really different between that and like, the more civil, genteel stylings of George W. Bush. But I think with, helming a country during a pandemic, messaging is really important. Hydroxychloroquine, for example, would never have happened under any other president except Trump. And, Biden's doing a better.
Romney wouldn't have half jokingly floated injected in bleach.
Yeah.
Clean him out, just get the virus out.
Yeah. So from that sense, I think Biden is a pretty powerful upgrade. The holding the funding hostage, which I do think was at the crux of why the beginning of the vaccine rollout was such a clusterfuck. I think that would have happened not only under another Republican, but given the structure of votes under that president, probably would have happened under President Hillary Clinton too. I mean, I don't think that the Republicans would have wanted to free that up. So, in that sense, the beginning was going to be a problem. And you're right that federal websites would have been hard, but having a website that was the same everywhere, that was streamlined, and then freeing up local health officials to do other things and to build up their distribution program in other ways, that would have been pretty clearly preferable, and that you'd have to have a bunch of strategies at once. But, ultimately, credit where credit's due, the vaccine distribution really is going way better now.
Yeah, no, I mean, for sure. I mean, those are, the two big things that I was hoping that we get from Biden replacing, Trump, as somebody who was always pretty cynical about, somebody who was always pretty pessimistic, about the prospects for Biden, changing his stripes, were that, one, that he'd stop that he wouldn't appoint hardcore union busters to the NLRB. That's kind of that's not an issue that most people track, but I think they should. And two, that the COVID response, wouldn't be quite as ludicrously, inept and negligent, which again, I agree with you. I don't even think it would have been under another Republican, because it's just from the perspective of, keeping the country running, for the sake of capital, I think any reasonably competent reactionary politician would have done better than Trump did. I mean, it's you'd be hard pressed to find a worse person to be there at that particular moment. That we have an unprecedented catastrophe. Who's going to be president right now? It's the weird. It's the weird racist from Celebrity Apprentice, who talks in freedom of consciousness. That's the guy who's going to be, that's the guy who's going to be at the helm at that moment.
Yeah.
And it makes, as far as a centrist bellwether goes, I guess, this is the time that it that really does matter, having somebody like that in power. If you're not going to get any genuine leftist that wants to change anything, at the very least, as I guess scientific and popular opinion kind of has one consensus, the consensus guy, it's all right, things are going to improve because that guy is just going to go with whatever, whatever the current logic of the crisis is.
Yeah. I'll also say this will be cheesy, but I do think it's worth pointing out. It was striking to me, I think it was Biden's first week in office, that he had a memorial for victims of the coronavirus and a moment of silence. And it struck me that how crazy it was that there was never a moment like that of public mourning from Trump. And as much as, those things are political theater, et cetera, but it feels like during a pandemic of this magnitude, I think that was meaningful and that was important. And it is just startling when you're oh, holy shit, our former president just presided over the deadliest pandemic in anyone's lifetime and never acknowledged the dead.
Yeah, right. I guess I won't say it's at the worst end of the spectrum.
No, it's just surprising
of possible responses. The very worst end of the spectrum of public responses is Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, who was like giving, press conferences about how, like, if you were a real man, you wouldn't be so worried about getting the virus, like that's, like, so it could be even worse. But, but yeah, the Trump response was pretty close to the worst end of how somebody in that position could have handled it. But before we let Natalie go, Forrest, you had a Fauci clip?
Yeah. So this is it came up a couple of days ago, and Fauci was talking to, I think, people on the pharma side of the healthcare spectrum at like some conference, and he's talking about how he was talking about how he doesn't agree with price controls on the COVID vaccine, and I thought it would be interesting to talk about the limits of capitalism in healthcare.
All right. While he's pulling that up, we have a super chat from Darius Hennon, who asks, "Would Congress feel more compelled to act on M4A if states started their own programs first and were successful?" Any thoughts about that?
Yeah, so I think that there are a lot of legal challenges with state level single payer that try to be ameliorated. Ro Khanna has introduced a bill that would basically do things like reallocate Medicare funding that goes to a certain state into a state single payer pool. So it kind of tries to smooth over and fix some of those legal complications. Right now, there is no mechanism to do that. So it's unclear how easy it would be, et cetera. States also can't command the same bargaining power that the federal government can. There are a lot of states, like New York, where a lot of their providers are used by people from out of state and vice versa. So there would be some kinks and some challenges, and it wouldn't be able to deliver the same promise as a federal level single payer program. But I do think that it's where some of the political conditions are more amenable right now, and that there are some states where there's, a years long organizing campaign already in place, and that those are a great thing to key into. And those bills give you a reason to knock on doors, as opposed to just knocking on doors to talk about a hypothetical bill at the national level, which can be a little harder. I think that those conversations potentially get easier at the local or state level. It is worth noting that is how the Canadian program got won. Saskatchewan was the first province to have it, and then it was eventually rolled out over the course of a few more decades. I prefer the national route, but I think that we should be, pushing any model we can. And there's not, as far as I understand, there's not like a single state level single payer supporter alive who doesn't want national level single payer too. So, the idea of like what's better, state or national, is, knock on wood, ultimately just a tactical question. But yeah, I mean, if you are in a state with a robust single payer movement, definitely get keyed into it. It's a great way to organize.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense to me, like, even though, I mean, obviously everything you said about like the drawbacks of, of state, like the things that you could deliver with national single payer that, that you can't with any kind of state level program.
Mm-hmm.
Is definitely right, and of course and for sure right, the goal is national single payer, but I kind of like the idea, like where it is politically possible, where there are like if there are states where there's enough momentum that could actually conceivably happen at a state level. I kind of like the idea of pursuing that. Just because I do tend to think that a big part of the problem right now with mobilizing people around single payer is that even so many people who like the idea, like, have that kind of, bone deep capitalist realism. It just doesn't sound like something that would really happen. And so if you can like point to like, oh yeah, in California, they have, Cali Care or whatever, that like everybody who lives there gets automatically like that, like that just makes it, that would be something that would make it seem more real. It's like, oh yeah, sure, they have that in California. Why couldn't we have that nationally?
Yeah, I think one problem, industry, if it sees the writing on the wall in that way, would absolutely jump on a state level campaign and would find it much easier to topple than a national level campaign. So the influx of opposition would be even more of a threat at the state level. Right. So I think if it gets to that point, Medicare for All supporters in other states will have to, really extend solidarity and think of it as their fight too, even if they're not in the state in question. But yeah, I mean, it would be great to see bills, advance further. And they've passed at least one chamber in New York and California over the past couple of years. So that is a big deal. And, I'd love to see more of that.
Fair enough. All right, let's do the Fauci clip.
There's obviously a lot of discussion about access and affordability of any future vaccine or therapeutic interventions for COVID. And I know our companies are working closely with the US government and others around the world to make sure that a vaccine can be made broadly available. You've commented before that in your experience during past public health emergencies, that the private sector has been a good partner and not priced vaccines in a way that had made them unaffordable. Yet there are some who want to impose price controls on the products before they're developed. Would such efforts help or hurt your ability to partner with the private sector in bringing new vaccines to market?
So this is what's called get Tony in trouble question.
Those are the fun ones, aren't they?
Yeah, those are the real fun for you. But then when we're done, it's not so much fun for me. No, I mean, I have a lot of experience over the years dealing with pharmaceutical companies in which we're trying to develop an intervention. And the one thing that is clear is that if you try to enforce things on a company that has multiple different opportunities to do different things, they'll walk away. They will walk away. So as much as you'd like to see fair pricing, I think to force something on a company as opposed to work with them to try and get an understanding, particularly if the federal government helps them in the development of a product for a public health issue, that they will in good faith make it available to those groups, countries, nations that really can't afford it very well. You don't want them to be, I mean, obviously it's a profit-driven industry. You people know that a heck of a lot more than I do because I don't deal in that space. I just deal with the people who deal in that space. And when you're dealing with something that has to have some kind of an economic return, you can't just do something and just give it away. You've got to have some degree of profit. And that has to be taken into consideration, as long as it isn't in such an outrageous way that it completely makes something out of the realm of the people who really need it. And often, I mean, I feel like I'm preaching. I'm sorry, but I'm telling you things you already know very well, that many of these outbreaks disproportionately affect regions of the world that cannot afford a very expensive intervention. So that's the reason why we've got to work with each other in good faith, that we're going to help. But I don't see I've never seen a successful attempt at doing controls. And people ask, and the Congress asks, well, why don't you just say that you have, but there's a reasonable pricing clause that you might remember from way back in some laws that were passed. The big question is, what is a reasonable price? That was something that was very difficult in agreeing upon.
So I have the
thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, in a nutshell, he's not wrong, but the answer isn't, as a result, we have to let pharma do what it wants. The answer is public manufacture of pharmaceutical goods. Right. So that's the way forward. I've been advocating that for a while. It seems pretty straightforward to me. I mean, he's right. Like, they are for-profit industries. You can't expect them to give these things away for free. They depend on profit, et cetera. And that's why they shouldn't be producing these goods. I mean, that's why we should build an institution that doesn't require them.
Yeah, that's kind of where I don't know, wanted to hear the conversation go, in the sense of, like, just the systemic failing of capitalism to deal with a crisis like this. And, like having for-profit industries, I guess, in charge of the response to a crisis like this just seems like a massive failure on a moral scale, but also just like on a distribution scale. Like, I know Ben's written about that for Jacobin before.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I mean, this is something that like Lee Phillips and Mikhail Rozhwersky talk about in People's Republic of Walmart. That have it. Yeah, I always recommend that. That having for-profit, pharmaceutical companies, having having control over the direction of research is potentially catastrophic, I mean, in terms of, the sort of race to, to have the antibiotics, that catch up to the evolution of the organisms, they're trying to counter, which like is something that could, sooner than we'd like to think, I mean, like could really have devastating effects, because if you don't have workable antibiotics, I mean, then like you're sort of back to Victorian medicine and, lopping off limbs. And the reason, and the reason for that is that that's just not where the profit, incentives, line up with, like it's, and or you could even think about the COVID vaccine, which of course it's remarkable how quickly that we got it anyway. Although, as Abdul pointed out in the first half, that's public R&D anyway, as far as most of the funding goes. But like, there's also a question about why there wasn't massive research money being put into coronaviruses after SARS and MERS, which were both like near misses for the kind of thing, that is happening right now, globally with COVID. And I mean, you don't have to say anything conspiratorial about that. It's just like straightforwardly looking ahead to things that might or might not be a big problem in 5 or 10 years.
There's literally videos of scientists being like, the next thing is going to be some form of coronavirus, like just so, everyone is aware, like that's the next pandemic that's going to hit.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, yeah.
Oh yeah. So, I want to, so I said public manufacture, I think is the ultimate solution to this problem. It's not as if there's nothing you can do up to that point. I mean, other countries can and do more effectively regulate their pharmaceutical prices better than we do. There's a different, like, regulating pharmaceutical prices without changing the insurance system won't be as helpful to patients. If you have like a $6,000 deductible, a certain drug costing $2,000 instead of $4,000 isn't going to be a particular relief. I mean, $2,000 or $4,000 is lower than the deductible, so that actually would make a difference. But if someone has a $6,000 deductible and you're able to bring it down, otherwise it doesn't necessarily help. But all of that said, I mean, I think that public manufacture, or a lot more public control of these companies, I think that that's an underrated argument. Is not only does it bring drug prices down, but it brings in, under democratic control or some semblance of it, what drugs get funded, what research gets funded, and now that's completely profit driven. So that's why like no one was doing low-level R&D for coronaviruses that didn't exist yet, or coronaviruses that hadn't killed that many people. I mean, no one was going to put that money into it, and instead they're going to allocate money. I mean, like the classic cliche example is like, a cure for male pattern baldness. They'll always be funneling money into, different like.
Are you saying that's not important?
It's, put in some money, sure, but like that profit dictated research allocation is a big deal, and that you also have a lot of development along the lines of they have a super popular drug, and so then they spend money either doing patent tomfoolery and litigating with other companies, or shallowly changing some drug so that you can keep your patent for however long. So a lot of those things are completely inefficient and ultimately keep us from getting the type of R&D and the type of drugs that we would want.
Yeah,
And it's a really, oh, sorry, Ben. If you
I
want
was just going to say, I mean, it's worth contrasting it with where, like, spheres where we do have public planning. Like, I mean, obviously, you know, my, I'm a leftist. My least favorite, part of public spending is military spending. But it is also significant if you're just thinking about it structurally. That like when the Pentagon does funding requests, it's about it's premised on like all sorts of fanciful scenarios about things that might or might not happen in the future.
Yeah.
And we don't like that's not how pharmaceutical, like if you had public pharmaceutical manufacturing, like I think that's the sort of thing that shows you that you could have, hey, here are some scientists say that this is some danger that might be coming down the pike in a few years. We
could all be bald. We could all be bald. That's the next pandemic. No.
I didn't mean to pick on baldness. I'm sorry.
No, I'm just kidding.
No, I would see out here, and here I was just trying to remember the name of the baldness drugs that Homer Simpson takes.
I don't know.
I also think it's the easiest. I mean, it's a really easy argument to make. Like public policy and like a more public system of like how they research like what drugs are going to get funded, because it's public money going into that. So it's like your tax dollars going into what they're choosing to research, and then pharmaceutical companies kind of getting to decide that. I think it's a really easy argument to make, like, like democratizing it. Like your money goes into researching it. Don't you want to have some say in what they research?
Well, yeah. And, obviously like the public money that goes into research, like that specific money is earmarked. But, I mean, a company having an R&D budget and they also get federal allocations, obviously, you can only separate those dollars so much. But yeah, I think it would be nice, healthcare ultimately to bring all the conversations together. Healthcare is so obviously a valuable public good, and treating it like one would certainly mean that we should have democratic control over what sort of drugs get researched and what get made, and that should be based on need rather than profit, and that's true for the healthcare system writ large. And we're pretty far from that point now, and we should do whatever we can to get closer to it.